Hey everyone, Emmerron here. So today I'd like to cover another topic in our How to GM series. So now that we have seen some writing, we've seen how to run a game, we've seen kind of how those two interlock. Now I want to talk about game balance. So game balance is probably one of the things that GMs who have played other systems will recognize that like it's a thing each system kind of has to grapple with separately, and some systems do a better job of it than others. In my experience, Cyberpunk Red is probably one of the better systems as far as balance is concerned. So, in the back of the book, they describe a couple different classes of enemies that you'll fight. These being mooks, lieutenants, and mini bosses, and they tag a fourth class on kind of in its own category. I'll kind of leave that out because it's not super relevant to what we're talking about, but the other three are pretty important. So to start with, the lowest class of enemy is a mook. A mook is something that is 1-to-1 equivalent power to the players, more or less. It's going to be a bit weaker than them because the idea is that these enemies should not be deadly, but they should provide a combat challenge. So if you are sending in a 1-to-1 ratio of mooks to your players, then the fight will be a relatively even one. It's probably one that if the party does particularly well or they roll particularly well, they will roll right over them and it shouldn't be a problem for them. The next class above a mook is going to be a lieutenant. Now, these are going to be enemies that are a little more challenging. They require a little more manpower and firepower to put down. They're a little better armed. They are intended to be used with some degree of tactics in mind, and they're worth 2 of those mooks. So in other words, every 2 players, you can throw 1 lieutenant and have it be a relatively even fight. Now, I have done encounters in my game where I will throw multiple lieutenants against the party in excess of that ratio, and it's worked out fine. But bear in mind, and I'm going to talk about this in a bit, my party is very combat optimized. So I wouldn't recommend doing that if you're new to the game. I'd recommend following the ratios I'm going to describe here as closely as possible while you're new, and then only starting to tweak that once you have a better feel, because I do think that a lot of encounter design in Cyberpunk is able to be done by feel relatively easily. There are some issues with it, but we'll get to that later. So lieutenants are, like I said, a little more tactical, and they do hit a bit harder. They're usually equipped with a little bit better gear. So they have things like where a mook maybe used poor quality weapons, a lieutenant is typically going to have better quality weapons, at least standard quality. And they might have things, equipment like armor up to light armor jack. So it does enable a little more staying power in a fight. They are more prone to carrying a fight into your player's health being in the red a little better. Especially early on. I would say lieutenants early on feel a lot more threatening than maybe they will later in a campaign or a progressive play kind of scenario. So this brings us to our third and final group of enemies, these being mini bosses. So mini bosses are an enemy type that are 3-to-1. So in other words, for every 1 mini boss in your encounter, you are going to have 3 players to compensate for that. So if you've got a group of 3 players, this mini boss might just be a boss, right? This is a one-man wrecking ball. If you use them in the right context or with the right equipment or with the right environment, they will wipe the floor with your party potentially, especially if you put more than one of them on the table. Now, in Neon Inferno, I have a crew of 5 people. And so with 5 people, 2 mini bosses usually is okay. I had a small incident as of the time of recording this. It would have been just earlier this week, where my party ran into 2 mini bosses that I buffed that caused some problems. But by and large, you're probably going to be okay if a mini boss is more or less, 3-1. 5-2, is a little off that, but it works out. Again, if you know kind of the environment or your party. So now that we've talked about that, you're all going to be asking, okay, well, Emmerron, that's a great lesson. I could read that out of the back of the core rulebook. And I'd tell you, yes, you could read that out of the core rulebook. The reason I'm telling you about it, though, is because I have power gamers at my table. And those of you coming from other tabletop games like D&D, as a prime example of this, might have some feelings, some emotions about that word, power gaming. It's something that if you GM long enough and you have friends or a play group that has the type of people in them that, if we all played a video game together, these are the kind of people who will be basically trying to optimize themselves as quick as possible towards a pinnacle of strength, one way or another. And while this can look a little different depending on what you're optimizing for, if the thing you're optimizing for is combat, it can make it very difficult to present deadly threats to your party, because these people who are more aligned with power gaming are by and large going to wipe the floor with anything you throw at them, with the sole exception of something like overwhelming force. If you throw overwhelming force in their direction, they may not last, but it also slows combat way down. So in general, the rule of thumb, at least in Cyberpunk's combat system, is we want to make bigger single enemies instead of making more little enemies. Because each of those little enemies, unless you are operating them in a crowd during an initiative count, you are going to have to roll each of their initiatives separately. If you're playing pen and paper, this is especially true, that you will have to track each of their ammo counts individually. And you will need to have a much harder time as the GM tracking where and what everything is. Now, because my crew plays in Foundry, it is a little different for us. We do not have too much to think about there because I have a handy little auto initiative tracker that monitors everyone's status on the board. And so when the time comes up for my crew to act, I can see very clearly, okay, it's your turn, it's your turn, it's your turn. And even with that tool in some of these larger fights, I've managed to nearly skip people's turns. So it is something that warrants mentioning, that we like smaller encounters with tougher enemies than we do larger encounters with weaker enemies. And while there may be certain times where that might be justified, the game gets much clunkier. So now that I've made that point as well as I think I can without a game example to maybe showcase why this is the case, let's talk about one of the sets. Well, it's not one DLC, it's more like 3, but there are several DLC that our Telsorian Games have released as a part of the Cyberpunk Red extended library of stuff on their website. So these are the Hardened Mook supplement, the Hardened Lieutenant supplement, and the Hardened Mini Bosses supplement. Now, the first time that I had a crew of players who saw me drop hardened enemies against them, they were asking me, Emmerron, what are you doing? That's dangerous. That's very scary. I don't like that. And my response to them was, you will be fine, because you have optimized so that you are more resistant to death than the average edge runner. And so what I want to cover really quick, because they give in the Hardened Lieutenants DLC, and I believe they repeat this in the Hardened Mini Bosses DLC, but they give us a definition for what a hardened character is, and therefore how do we define a hardened party. So a hardened character is a player character who has a reflex of 8 combined with a dodge skill of 6 or higher, so evasion of 6 or higher. The ability to attack with a stat plus skill plus mod of 15 or higher. So in other words, if you are a base 14 with a +1 weapon, you are meeting this criteria. A will plus body of 16 or higher, meaning that if you have a body and will of 8 each right out the gate, like a new edge runner could have that and be hardened immediately because you become incredibly difficult to kill then. Later on, this may also take the form of a edge runner who chooses to get certain cybernetic augmentations and increases their body stat through that cyberware, because it does give you a lot of health. I believe at that level you're at 50 health, and that's without any cyberware. So continuing, the player owns a weapon with a value of luxury or higher. So for reference, that would mean it is a 5,000 eddy or greater weapon. A dex of 8 combined with a move of 8, which would allow you to move about as quickly as you can as a player character, combined with the ability to basically be in melee range and beat people up. Dex also governs evasion, so you're going to run into some other issues with that as well. Auto fire or martial arts skill of 6 or higher. So it doesn't even mention a stat base for that. It just says if you have one of these at 6 or higher, like, you're hardened, because they are both really powerful skills if they start landing with any real accuracy or frequency. And then finally, the one that I laughed at the most when I saw this is a solo of rank 4 or higher. So for your crews who don't have a solo in them, you are among the few that might stand a chance of having none of these conditions, right? Most crews are probably, if you've been playing the game any length of time, gonna have at least one person in your crew that roughly meets that criteria or meets at least part of those bullet points, right? And a player is hardened if they meet any one of those bullet points. So bear in mind, it is not a multiple choice thing here. They only need to meet one of those many criteria for them to be considered hardened. Now, a hardened crew logically follows as a team of players for whom all of them meet at least one of those points of criteria. So, in cases like this, there are some times, right, or maybe our whole crew isn't hardened or isn't hardened yet, right? Because obviously skills can change over time. Equipment certainly changes over time. So getting that luxury weapon down the road may happen. Ultimately, though, when we get to a point that even I would say most of our party is hardened, we are going to start looking into the possibility of including a couple of these hardened enemies in our games. And they typically harden them in the book by giving them slightly better stats, slightly better skill bases, slightly better equipment, and it's overall just kind of elevates things up a level, right? So an enemy maybe that would have only had 4 SP on their armor initially, maybe now they're wearing Kevlar, meaning they've got 7 SP. Or maybe if they were wearing Kevlar before, now they're wearing light armor jack, which is 11 SP. And so you could start to see like that adds a couple more rounds that Mook's going to be around. It layers on some extra quality weapons. Some at the very high end, like the hardened mini bosses, will actually have excellent quality weapons, meaning that they're getting a +1 on top of their skill base, whatever that is, governing the weapon that they are using. So ultimately, obviously, we want to be very careful with these. However, if you have a table of mostly, or especially if every player in your crew is hardened, or by this game's definition, at that point, a power gamer who is like very tactical and they're very good at the tactics give and take of this game, then you might throw whole crews of hardened enemies against them. Early on, it even mentions hardened mooks, the 1-to-1 guys. Those you can kind of sparingly throw in with the other ones if your whole crew isn't hardened. because they present enough of a challenge without being an overwhelming threat to those kind of non-optimized crews. And so we can do that, but, and this is a big but, if your party isn't hardened, or if only maybe one, so say you have a solo, right? And that is your whole hardened qualification for the party, do not throw hardened enemies against them. Even the mooks. Like I would argue even the mooks, unless you have a very good sense that the crew can handle it, they will kill your players. Like they will absolutely kill your players. But this is a great solution to those encounters that maybe you play a couple gigs with your team and you say to yourself, that felt not great. It felt like the enemies were a little too soft. They just fell over at the first sign of contact with my solo. If that's the case, then yeah, hardened enemies. That's your next progression, right? You can also always replace equipment. And there are a couple of roll 10 tables, like so D10 tables at the start of each of these documents that explain certain substitutions that you can make, or even just randomly assign to a mook in your team that adds a little extra threat to them in case your crew is still able to run over them most of the time. So now that we're coming to the end of the lecture section of this video, I want to give a couple of examples here, just brief ones from my experience as a GM. So the first example I'm going to give is of my crew when they first started playing Neon Inferno from our very first gig. So there were a couple of encounters I did very early on where the only things that they were fighting were things that were statted as either bodyguards or booster gangers out of the back of the book. And if you want a reference for the more or less the baseline that I was running the gig off of, look up Red Chrome Cargo. I'll cover it in another video in a little more detail as my opinion as a GM. So if you GMs out there want a little bit of review for like what I think are good supplements, I will be doing a little more of that later on in this series. But Red Chrome Cargo, in a nutshell, has the crew sneaking aboard a train and stealing the goods off that train that your fixer wants back. And it tells you in the document which mook types from the back of the core rulebook you should be using to run that gig in a way that it is challenging for any crew. So when my players first started playing, very few of them were combat optimized. There was one or two maybe, but you know, 1 or 2 out of 5 is less than half. So we kept the regular mooks in there and they worked perfectly. They gave them enough of a scare that when one of them popped off a crit injury on a player, it got terrifying for that player temporarily. And so when we got to the point where the party got to the end of that and they were, you know, taking out the last of the enemies, it felt satisfying because no one got that close to death, but the people who took critical injuries, they felt it. The people who got lucky felt powerful, right? The ones who prepared and were able to get out of the way of the enemies. Those players had a great time because they felt like power gaming badasses, right? Even if they weren't power gamers in the truest sense, right? In the dictionary sense that we've talked about so far, they felt powerful. And that's important. It's important to give players, especially on a first outing, that sense of like, you are a powerful person in this world, but the world also is full of other powerful people who could take you out. So now let's fast forward to what is, as of this recording, the most recent episode of Neon Inferno, which is episode 16 for those of you who are watching that series alongside this. So in that episode, not to spoil anything for those of you who are partway through the series, there was an incident where I threw 2 mini bosses who I had enhanced. I had done something that felt wrong to me. And while I won't say that it was the wrong decision, even now, looking back on it, having discussed things with some of the players that were involved, what I did was I added 2 extra points to the melee weapon skill base of 2 of the enemies that were mini bosses who already had a skill base of 16. So mathematically, the maximum that you get with raw stats on any skill in the game is 18, which now these guys had. They also had excellent quality heavy melee weapons. So they were rolling base 19 against whatever evasion the players could muster. As you might imagine, having a minimum skill check of basically 20, and that is the lowest that they could roll, meant that most players were having a really hard time evading these guys. And my whole party is hardened at this point. All of them have high dodge. All of them have the ability to scramble out of the way of fighting if they need to. All of them are very proficient fighters. Even that said, 2 mini bosses with these stats and these weapons proved to be too much for them. There were 2 players, one of them a solo and one of them a med tech, that were both critically wounded and barely had time to stabilize themselves in the fight, so they didn't die. And we had a second solo who just straight up was flatlined during the fight. And this was not my intention for that design. The encounter design was not such that I had planned on creating that much of a wall for my players. What I wanted to create was a sense of tension. I wanted to create a sense that this is a deadly world still, and the things you are now beginning to encounter as your reputation has increased within the world is the world of mega corporations and their near infinite resources against you. And while I think that point got across, it definitely sailed a little further beyond where I wanted it to land, right? They always tell you in sports shooting to always check beyond your target, right? Always understand not only what you're shooting at, but what lies behind it. So that if you overshoot or miss your target, you don't accidentally catch something else in the crossfire. And to me as a GM, this felt very much like I didn't check, right? Because there was one of my players at the end of the game who was very upset with me and felt that I didn't do a good enough job signaling other ways that they could have avoided the reckoning that was about to come. And while I will say that Cyberpunk is such that sometimes you won't get that warning, and I can justify my action that way, it is worth noting that these tuned up characters, if you do the wrong thing and adjust the wrong stuff, they can instantly, even over 1 or 2 points, because that's all I modified from the base stat block of these, was 2 points. That's all it took to completely break these guys. Because in other combat encounters, these guys have been rolled over by my party. No problem at all. This particular time, my party got rocked by them. So yeah, that is what I will leave you with as a play example for tonight's video. I hope you all have learned something. If there are any useful bits of advice that any of you have for creating adequate power level encounters for a party, I would love to hear those in the comments down below. And I would love to interact with you all and have a conversation as always about any of these things I discussed in this series. So that'll do it for tonight's video. I hope you found this informative. I hope you found this enjoyable. And I hope if I've earned it, you like and subscribe. It does help a smaller creator like me in the algorithm that YouTube presents. And until next time, I hope you stay healthy, stay safe, and I will see you on the streets of Night City next week. Peace.